Let's dive into the SEC. And I had a real tough time because I think you could argue the top tier is a team, the Georgia Bulldogs. And I think they're the clear-cut best team in all of college football. But the playoff's going to be much more difficult. The SEC is going to be much more difficult. There are no divisions. There's a deeper conference. It's no different than the rest of these conferences. They're all dealing with a very different dynamic and structure. And I think expectations to go 14, 15, 16-0, 17-0, I don't think these are fair expectations anymore for college football fans. I think we just have to I think it's going to take something special, truly special, to be perfect and undefeated. And while this offense might be better than some of the offenses of the past, the defense is not going to be better than it was two or 3 years ago when they were historically, epically great. But they're still clearly, in my opinion, number one. So, but I think you have to broaden it out in the SEC because we've seen Georgia lose that game. They did it last year. So I think you have to broaden it out to not 2, not 3, not 5, 7 teams. I have 7 teams I think could get to the SEC championship game. I am not including Oklahoma because I think Oklahoma's schedule is too difficult and they have too many questions, offensive line, quarterback. I'm not going to include A&M because I just don't think that's hand very much way back. That's like putting your face back on the burner. Right. Like, this is not okay. But I think there's 7 teams. I think there are 7 teams that you could say are on the top tier of the SEC that could get into the SEC title game.
I agree with you. I am intrigued by Texas A&M because of their home schedule, because they get Notre Dame, they get Missouri, they get Texas at home. They have some opportunities to pick up some marquee wins in College Station. And I do think there is a ton of talent in this program. It's just been waiting for the right coach and the right staff to sort of unlock that. But all that being said, to me, the top 7 was clear. I had the same 7 as you did. I have Georgia sort of in tier 1, but also I think there's a little bit of separation between Georgia and some of these other teams vying for a spot in the SEC championship game.
Yeah, like I said, I think Georgia is on a plateau all their own, but I don't think if you had to compare this Georgia team to the 2 teams that won rings, I'm not sure where I'd put them. I might put them 3rd. Honestly, I think defense, it's amazing what happens when you lose Jordan Davis and Jalen Carter in back-to-back years.
Yeah.
And Kobe Dean and on down the list. They got to replace. They still are loaded on defense. They still have depth. They still have 2. They've got probably the number 1 overall pick maybe in Williams. Like they're loaded. But and Carson Beck might be the number 2 pick in the draft or the number 1 or flip those 2. So I think they're on a tier by themselves. But are they beatable? Absolutely, absolutely, they're beatable in the SEC and in the playoff. So
the schedule's a lot harder this year too.
So much harder
than it was last year. So like you said, it is going to be very difficult. I think it was already difficult for teams to go 14-0. It's 15-0. It's going to be even harder in this era of the playoff, and then with more conference games potentially even harder down the road.
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the Georgia team that was the epically historically great team wasn't the one that went undefeated. Right? It was the next year's team.
Yes.
So Texas Longhorns. Let's go with them. What they've got, they just replaced a ton of weaponry, 2 giant defensive tackles, both drafted highly in the NFL. And when I say giant, I mean really big. What is the biggest question for Texas's roster that keeps them from getting to the SEC championship game?
I'm not worried about their receiving core. I think they brought in enough weapons from the transfer portal. I think Xavier Worthy and A.D. Mitchell are pretty special players, but I think they can get enough production out of the other guys. I think what worries me the most about Texas is I would just group defense as a whole, but there are 2 parts to that. I think number 1 is the interior line of scrimmage. You take away Sweat and Murphy. They had a fine pass rush last year. I think they could use more. It's one of the reasons why they went out and got Trey Moore, the UTSA edge rusher, who can help a little bit this year with that. But how do you replace 2 guys in the middle of your interior that were so valuable? Bill Norton, the Arizona transfer, that's probably one solution. The other part of this is the secondary. They gave up a ton of big plays. It wasn't very good last season. Is it going to be better this year? So it's almost interior and then the secondary for me. Texas defense as a whole has to step up if they want to get past Georgia and win the national championship.
I don't disagree. I think you're going to have to win battles along the line of scrimmage, but their offensive line is going to be really good. So we'll see what happens on the defensive side of the ball. Alabama, well, I was going to say, you're going to say secondary, but there's more questions. I guess this is my was going to be my first question. Are there more questions with this Alabama team than ever before? I mean, there's still a top 3 or 4 roster in America. They have their quarterback's back. Are there more spots on this team that you have questions about than ever before?
Yes, I think what's kind of interesting about Alabama is you and I, when we have gone through the sort of prediction process every year when we're doing our magazine, we sort of just assume Alabama is going to reload under Nick Saban. There's sort of a different feeling this year with Kalen DeBoer taking over. You don't quite know what to expect. I think they're going to be very good. They have a ton of talent still in the program, but there is a different kind of level of feeling going into this year, a little bit more of an unknown than I
Yeah.
think maybe you would have expected if Nick Saban was still the coach. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, you can't take the greatest, most consistent coach in the history of the game away from a program and expect to then predict consistency, right? Like
Yeah.
you have to open your eyes and say we just don't know. Like I think Kalen DeBoer is one of the best minds in offense in all of the game. I think Jalen Milroe is one of the best athletes, and I still think he gets undervalued by conversations and media people and fans. I still don't understand that. The guy's first 3 steps are better than anybody's in all of college football from an athleticism standpoint. I still don't get it. He's very much a Michael Vick clone to me, and I think there's a chance Kalen DeBoer unlocks all of that potential. Now, it doesn't mean he's not a flawed player or has some issues he needs to work through or whatever, but the guy was a top 5 Heisman guy for a reason. But yeah, I just the thing that made Nick Saban great was creating the consistent level of effort and production, and it's you against yourself. It's removing the human element, and you can't do that with even as good as Kalen DeBoer has been and as good as Jalen Milroe is. You can't do that with this team. So I think there's actually a much wider range. I think Alabama could win the whole thing, and I think Alabama could lose 3 or 4 times, and that's a wider range than we've had for Alabama in a long time.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think if Nick Saban was still the coach, I think we would just assume they probably would be closer to, and they still might finish there. But I would say in most preseason rankings, I have seen them closer to 6 or 7. I think they'd be a lot closer to 3 or 2 if Nick Saban was still the head coach. But in
I
the
think they'd be.
overall,
I think they'd be
go ahead.
3. I think they'd be 3 if
Yeah,
he's the coach. I think it'd be Georgia, Ohio State, Bama. I
yeah,
think.
I think that's fair.
Yeah.
I think they're without a doubt though. If they want to get past Georgia, I think it's what we talked about a second ago. I think it's the secondary. They brought in Damani Jackson, Keon Sabb as transfers, as freshmen. They're going to start right away. I wouldn't necessarily read too much into the spring game where they gave up some big plays. I think
Nope.
in time they'll probably sort it out. But it is a question coming into this year for sure.
All right. 2 teams with established stars at quarterback, Ole Miss and Missouri. Missouri just lost a lot of senior leadership. So my answer for Missouri would be established senior leadership at key positions, linebacker, 2 corners, safe, pass rusher, left tackle. Like they lost key pieces at veteran leadership at key situations. So what is Missouri? I can't really worry about the offense because they have a lot back there. What is the biggest concern for Missouri?
It's probably a good thing if they have all that offensive firepower coming back, because I do think there are some questions about their defense. Start the coordinator spot. Blake Baker gone to LSU. Corey Batoon is the new defensive coordinator at Missouri. He was the defensive coordinator at South Alabama last year. Was it Kane Womack or was it Corey Batoon calling the plays? Whose scheme was it? That's a little bit of a mystery.
Yep.
So I think you have some uncertainty about what they're going to do from a schematic standpoint. They are losing a ton, and they are bringing in some guys in the portal and the freshman class who can play right away. But I think to your point, guys who were established in that program for 2-3 years under Eli Drinkowitz are gone at every level. They lost some depth at the defensive line. That group's probably going to take a step back. I think they can overcome that by having some offensive fireworks and a sort of easier schedule, maybe. But I do think defense will that side of the ball will dictate whether or not Missouri can make the playoff this year.
I agree. Ole Miss, Jackson Dart, all the transfer portal stuff, the investment. You got all the pieces there. They kind of consistently have gotten better under Lane Kiffin. I mean, it's hard to predict where the roster question is going to come because of the portal. And because here's my projection. I think there's going to be an issue with Ole Miss that we can't project. Does that make sense?
So I guess maybe along your lines, what would worry me is a team that is sort of brought together for 2024. There's an early loss or two, and you wonder if they can sort of fight their way back in the playoff. Is that kind of what you're going
Kind of.
for?
Okay.
Yeah.
Kind of. Give me two position groups on this roster that you think are the weakest, just real fast.
Well, the running back was until they've added through the portal. I think overall it'd be on the defensive side of the ball. I mean, pick two groups like that. Though, as a whole, the defense just has to be a lot better. I'm not really worried about anything on offense at this point.
Which one do you think they solved in the portal? Which ones do you think they solved in the portal?
I tend to think they solved most of
Defensive
their needs.
defensive
I
line.
mean, if you add Walter Nolan to your defensive front, kind of changed the whole dynamic of that defensive line. I think there's some questions maybe about the upside of their secondary, maybe.
So
But
so if you say like the front seven is the biggest concern on the roster, let's say, or the offensive, like what again, whatever. There's the obvious one, and then I think there's going to be one where we thought they solved it, and it maybe isn't.
that's fair.
That's what I'm getting at.
Yeah,
Because you can't. No one's ever tried to do what they're doing. Like you can't do a whole roster portal thing. You can do it like when you're Hugh Freeze and you're Auburn and you're trying to rebuild a roster after when you take over a team. I don't think you can do it like year 3, 4, 5 and trying to maintain 10-win status. I just don't. I think everyone thinks you can do it. Maybe this is different. Maybe they can. Maybe they figured it out. But I don't know. We've never seen anybody do this, so we don't know what it's going to look like.
I think to use a term that gets used a lot, it's unprecedented. Ole Miss just might have the pieces to do it. I mean, they won 11 games last season. They bring, you mentioned Jackson Dart. He's one of the best quarterbacks in the
I
country.
know. I know.
They've solved the running back things. I don't know. I don't think any of those are as good as Quinshot Judkins, but they got options. Their
Yeah.
receiving core is good. I mean, you bring in guys to improve your defense. After winning 11 games, and they're going all in, the bar is set very high. And I think what would worry me is an early
Yeah.
loss or
Yeah.
two, and then sort of it falls apart because they're not in the playoff race. That would be my big worry.
And they weren't built on like years of cohesion, right?
Yes.
Let me ask you this: is Michigan State with Mel Tucker going 11 wins and then like 3 wins? Is that the closest thing we've seen to what? Does that make sense? Like,
That does.
I know it
Yeah.
wasn't the same kind of portal rebuild, but like they were pretty portal heavy, right?
That would be sort of the fall, I think, that you would worry. Not maybe not as steep and not with some of the off the field craziness with Mel Tucker, but yeah, I think that's sort of a team that is put together over 2 years in the transfer portal, sort of a I don't know, hired, for hire roster, whatever, everybody coming together. If things don't work out,
I don't know. It just
there's
hit. It just came to
yeah,
me. It just kind of came to me like that they went to the portal and they got really good because of it, and then they went to the portal and it cost them because of it. And I just thought, but again, maybe rules are different today, and Ole Miss is doing it differently. So it doesn't mean that's what's going to happen. I just was trying to think of an example of a team that tried to do that because we've seen Colorado try to do it, and
right.
sure they got better, but they didn't actually accomplish anything. All right, Tennessee and LSU are the other two I would put in here. I think LSU's overall roster is slightly better than Tennessee. I think Tennessee's quarterback is going to be better than Garrett Nussmeier, and I trust the coaching staff as much on both sides. I have some questions about both these teams, but I think both these teams absolutely are championship contenders to get to the championship game. I don't know if they can win it, but I think they could get to the SEC championship game. What's your
Yeah,
biggest concern for LSU?
couple things. If you asked me to pick one, I think it would be defense probably, just because they were so bad on that side of the ball last season. And they have been searching for answers in the transfer portal in the secondary the last couple of years. They've had some hits, they've had a lot of misses. They're searching for help at the defensive tackle interior spot still in the spring window. So there's clearly not quite where they think they should be. Now, I think Blake Baker and this coaching staff are going to make a huge difference. I think everybody will be on the same page and they'll be coached appropriately this year. So they'll be better. How much better? I think that remains to be seen. I don't think we should totally overlook Mike Denbrock, though, going to Notre Dame as offensive coordinator. I know Joe Sloan, everybody behind the scenes at LSU really likes him, highly regarded. Mike Denbrock led the nation's #1 scoring offense last season. There's a new quarterback, there's new receivers, new OC. That's a lot of turnover. And so what would worry me is the offense is still very good, but the defense is maybe not there, and LSU doesn't go from double-digit wins to playoff contender. They sort of just stay where they are.
Well,
There's
this is not necessarily about the coaching staffs because this is more about the roster, this conversation. So, but I am very concerned about the offensive coaching staff for LSU. I have far fewer concerns about the defensive coaching staff now. But if you're talking about
right.
just players, 2 years in a row, they tried 2 different strategies in the portal for the defensive secondary. That's a problem. But you know what helps the secondary? A great defensive line. And I just saw Wingo and Smith get drafted, and they still got questions along the defensive front. Now, Harold Perkins could make a lot of plays this year, but I think it's the front seven does not feel like LSU. When you look at how good LSU can be, when they are championship good, national title good, they are absolutely loaded in the front seven. And I don't see, I don't see those guys in that front seven the way they were in 04 or 07 or 2019 or like I don't see those guys in the front seven. Maybe they're there, but the offensive line is incredible, and I think the offense is going to be fine. Tennessee, I think it's the secondary. I honestly think there's not a lot of questions for Tennessee. I think they're going to be pretty good everywhere. If you want to say, can you say back seven now? Like, because everyone runs like a 4 or 5 man front or an odd front. Like, linebacker? I think is a concern. There's no alpha there, but I think it's pass defense coverage in the back seven is the concern for me for Tennessee.
100%. I think from a schedule, quarterback, kind of where they are as a program, I think Tennessee's going to score a ton of points this year. I mean, the last year's offense was, I think, the lowest scoring offense that Josh Heupel's had as a head coach. And they're going to be better this year because they changed out the quarterback and needing Nico in there. Yep. From a defensive standpoint, yes, it is the secondary for me. They brought in a couple transfers in the first window. Those guys look to be pretty solid players to me. I don't know if they're kind of all SEC high end guys. Now, you could look at it another way. They frankly weren't very good at defending the pass the last couple of years. So if you turn over a bunch of personnel and try something different, maybe you find some improvement there. So secondary is by far my biggest concern for Tennessee going into 2024.
I agree. I think what's interesting about the conference, though, is there's very few questions at the most important position on all of those 7 teams. And that's what makes this conference super interesting, is that the 7 best quarterbacks basically play at the 7 best teams, and they all could be pushing for playoff spots this year, which I don't think is possible based on like math. I think there's too many losses in the schedule, but otherwise I think all these teams could be fighting for playoff spots and for a spot in the conference championship game. It's going to be really, really good race in the SEC based on great quarterback play in that conference. All right, so those are your contenders and the one big question for contenders in the SEC.